Today, we are breaking down a moment that is not just another heated exchange in a confirmation hearing, but one of the most revealing instances in the entire process. This was a moment when Senator Rosen challenged Pete Hegseth directly on issues that form the very foundation of leadership in the Department of Defense: extremism, judgment, and national security. On the surface, it may have seemed like a standard Senate hearing, but beneath that, it was a test of character and values, a measure of whether someone in power understands that authority carries responsibility, not just privilege. When this exchange began, it looked procedural, almost routine. Yet, it quickly became clear that what was at stake was far deeper, the kind of judgment and integrity that underpins a nation's military and security apparatus. Senator Rosen opened with a question that was deceptively simple but profoundly important. Should every senior official in the Department of Defense reflect the values and conduct that service members uphold and that the American public expects? This was not about politics or ideology. It was about foundational principles. Military leadership is not defined solely by strategy, planning, or operational skill. It is defined by culture. Discipline, respect, integrity, and moral clarity must flow from the top down. When those at the top hesitate, equivocate, or fail to model those values, the entire chain of command is compromised. This opening question served as an early, clear test of Hegseth's judgment, integrity, and instinctive understanding of his role. The hearing quickly moved to the issue of anti-Semitism, a topic that is both morally and institutionally urgent. Senator Rosen did not ask a complicated legal question or pose a nuanced policy scenario. She asked something fundamental. Should anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, and extremist rhetoric have any place in the U.S. government or military? For any senior leader, the correct answer should have been instinctively clear, an unequivocal no. But hesitation appeared, subtle but telling. And in politics, hesitation can speak louder than words. It reveals whether a leader perceives moral red lines as fixed principles or negotiable points. Extremism is not minor concern, and conspiracy thinking is not harmless speculation. These are poisons that, if tolerated in institutions, can erode the very foundations of trust, discipline, and effectiveness. The stakes became even more concrete when Rosen cited a specific example. She referenced statements made by the Department of Defense Press Secretary, Ms. Kingsley Wilson, which have been widely criticized and were now in public discourse. Notably, Hegseth had promoted Wilson after these controversial statements were made. This was no longer a hypothetical debate about principles. It was a real-world test of his decision-making. The question became, when faced with documented concerns about extremism and bigotry, what did the nominee actually do in his leadership role? The actions or inaction revealed much about his judgment and priorities. This moment was critical not only for its immediate moral implications, but also for its symbolic meaning. Rising anti-Semitic violence, an increase in hate crimes, and growing threats to Jewish communities across the country provide context for why leadership in the Department of Defense cannot be indifferent. Promoting or failing to address individuals associated with extremist rhetoric sends a signal that values and principles are secondary to personal or political convenience. The Pentagon is not just a workplace. It is a symbol of the nation's values, both to Americans and the world. Leadership that tolerates or rewards behavior tied to extremist ideology undermines that symbol and weakens public trust. Hegseth's response, instead of acknowledging the seriousness of concern, shifted blame. He accused Senator Rosen of mischaracterizing the situation and playing political games. This reaction is revealing in itself. When leaders interpret scrutiny as hostility, oversight becomes impossible. Transparency and accountability are cornerstones of democratic governance, but they rely on leaders being willing to answer direct questions sincerely. Avoiding accountability or framing it as a personal attack signals a lack of understanding of the gravity of leadership responsibilities. This first segment of the hearing is essential because it goes beyond personalities. It exposes how hesitation, deflection, and avoidance on fundamental ethical questions can weaken institutions. When extremism, hate, and conspiracy thinking are met with ambiguity rather than clarity, cracks appear in the foundation of authority. These cracks can grow, particularly in a high-stakes environment like the Department of Defense, where decisions have global consequences and affect national security. This exchange serves as a warning. Without clearly defined values and firm moral guidance at the top, the exercise of power can become dangerous, unpredictable, and corrosive to the institution's credibility. In sum, this segment is a vivid illustration of the stakes involved in confirming senior defense officials. The questions were simple, but their implications are profound. They test whether leadership understands its moral obligations, its responsibility to maintain institutional integrity, and its duty to ensure that extremist ideology has no place in the military. Hegseth's hesitation and evasions in this exchange, rather than answering simple ethical questions, raised serious concerns about his readiness to lead and the principles he would uphold while in office. As the hearing progressed, the focus shifted from theoretical principles to concrete actions and decisions, highlighting a stark contrast between values and behavior. Senator Rosen moved to questions surrounding personnel decisions at the highest levels of the Department of Defense, specifically the sudden and controversial dismissal of General Hawk. Hawk, a highly respected figure who had served as both director of the National Security Agency and commander of U.S. Cyber Command, represented two of the most sensitive and consequential positions in America's national security apparatus. These roles are not symbolic. They carry real, tangible responsibilities over intelligence, cyber defense, surveillance, and the operational security of the nation. The abrupt nature of his removal, combined with reports linking the decision to social media influence, immediately raised alarms. Rosen's line of questioning was not partisan posturing. It was a probe into how personnel decisions are made at the very top of the defense hierarchy and whether they are guided by expertise, evidence, and national security priorities, or by external pressures without accountability. When Rosen directly asked whether Hegseth had been consulted about General Hawk's dismissal, the nominee's answers were careful, evasive, and repeatedly circular. Rather than providing a clear yes or no, he repeatedly emphasized that all decisions are made at the pleasure of the president, sidestepping the accountability and transparency that are expected of a leader in his position. This repeated deflection is significant. While it is true that senior military officials serve at the pleasure of the president, this constitutional principle does not absolve the Secretary of Defense from the responsibility to explain the rationale behind sudden, high-stakes decisions. Leadership is not merely about exercising authority. It is about being able to justify, articulate, and defend decisions, especially when those decisions impact national security, operational readiness, and institutional trust. The hesitancy to provide a clear explanation signals a concerning lack of transparency and raises questions about whether the department is being run in a disciplined, principled manner. The questioning then took a more pointed turn as Rosen highlighted reports suggesting that the decision to remove General Hawk may have been influenced by a social media personality, Laura Loomer, known for spreading conspiracy theories and extremist rhetoric. This is not a trivial matter. The idea that personnel decisions at the highest levels of national defense could be swayed by individuals with no formal authority, clearance, or expertise is deeply troubling. If true, it undermines not only the credibility of the Department of Defense, but also the integrity of the entire chain of command. Rosen's concern was not about personalities online. It was about the principle of governance. In a system where national security is at stake, decisions must be rooted in intelligence assessments, expert counsel, and documented reasoning, not in the influence of public figures or online advocacy. Hegseth's answers during this line of questioning further intensified these concerns. He deflected by questioning the reliability of media reports and asserting that he'd been consulted on every decision, but he offered no concrete details about his thought process or the justification for Hawk's removal. Moreover, when asked directly whether social media personalities should ever influence defense personnel decisions, he effectively sidestepped the question, leaving it unresolved. This avoidance reinforces perception of either lack of control over the department or a willingness to tolerate external influence in critical security matters. Both possibilities are deeply unsettling. The American public, allies, and adversaries alike rely on the Department of Defense to make decisions based on expertise, not on perception management or online pressure campaigns. This segment of the hearing illustrates a critical tension in modern governance, the intersection of authority, accountability, and external influence. The Department of Defense is not a political sandbox. It is a highly structured institution with enormous consequences for national and global security. Decisions regarding senior leadership, particularly those in cyber and intelligence roles, cannot be made lightly. When those in positions of ultimate authority avoid providing clear justifications or appear to tolerate influence from individuals outside the system, it erodes trust in the institution. Military personnel, from new recruits to four-star generals, depend on a predictable, principled chain of command. Any perception that decisions are arbitrary, politically motivated, or influenced by social media undermines morale and operational confidence. Beyond the immediate implications for General Hawk, this exchange speaks to broader systemic risks. If senior leadership demonstrates a pattern of evasiveness and deflection when faced with direct questioning about personnel and ethical standards, it sets a precedent. Future decisions may similarly evade scrutiny, and the norms that safeguard the integrity of the military and defense institutions may weaken over time. Rosen's insistence on clear answers, particularly when paired with rising extremist activity and public concern over hate speech, underscores the necessity of leadership that is both transparent and accountable. Without these qualities, the credibility of the Department of Defense, and by extension, the nation's security, can be compromised. Finally, this segment highlights the critical role of oversight in a functioning democracy. The confirmation hearing is not a ceremonial formality. It is a mechanism for evaluating whether a nominee possesses the judgment, values, and capability required to lead one of the most consequential departments in the government. Rosen's line of questioning, while direct and persistent, was designed to test whether Hegseth understands the gravity of his responsibilities and the ethical standards required of a senior defense official. By avoiding direct answers and framing accountability as political attack, Hegseth's responses inadvertently revealed the gaps between authority, responsibility, and ethical clarity that are essential for effective leadership in the Department of Defense. As the hearing progressed further, the discussion shifted from immediate personnel concerns to the broader implications of leadership culture within the Department of Defense. Senator Rosen emphasized not just individual decisions, but the values that shape the organization at its core. Leadership in the military is not merely about holding a title or exercising authority. It is about setting the tone for an entire institution. Every decision sends a message, not only to senior officials, but also to the men and women on the front lines, to civilians within the department, and ultimately to the public and allied nations observing the United States' conduct. When those at the top demonstrate hesitation in condemning extremist rhetoric or fail to provide clear ethical guidance, it communicates that values are negotiable, and that is a dangerous precedent. Rosen returned to the issue of anti-Semitism and extremist ideology, framing it in both moral and operational terms. The question was straightforward. Should extremist rhetoric, anti-Semitic beliefs, or conspiracy theories have any place in the Department of Defense? For a leader in such a critical position, the answer should be instinctive and unequivocal. Hesitation, equivocation, or attempt to contextualize or deflect from such questions reveal a concerning ambiguity about what is considered unacceptable. This is not a theoretical debate. It strikes at the heart of the department's integrity and cohesion. Military organizations rely on trust, mutual respect, and shared understanding of ethical boundaries. When leadership demonstrates tolerance or ambiguity regarding extremist beliefs, it undermines that trust and corrodes institutional stability. The example of Ms. Kingsley Wilson, the Department of Defense press secretary, crystallized this concern. Wilson had made statements that were widely criticized as aligning with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Rather than address these statements with accountability or remedial action, Hegseth had promoted her to a higher position. This decision sent a stark signal. Inaction or tacit approval of extremist rhetoric is acceptable at the highest levels of leadership. Rosen highlighted that this approach contradicts not only public commitments to combat anti-Semitism, but also the expectations of responsible governance. The situation revealed a disconnect between stated principles and real-world actions, demonstrating how leadership decisions directly influence the values and culture of the department. The exchange also illustrated a troubling pattern in Hegseth's responses: deflection, accusation, and avoidance. Instead of directly acknowledging the severity of the concerns raised, he framed Rosen's questions as political attacks. This is significant for several reasons. First, it reveals a defensive posture that prioritizes self-preservation over accountability. Second, it undermines the oversight function that confirmation hearings are designed to uphold. Finally, It signals to subordinates that ethical scrutiny and transparency may be optional rather than required. In an institution tasked with protecting national security, such a mindset threatens both credibility and operational effectiveness. Leadership is not merely a position of authority. It is a moral responsibility to ensure that standards are clear, enforced, and respected. The hearing then expanded into questions about decision-making processes, particularly regarding personnel changes in sensitive positions. The removal of General Hawk became emblematic of broader concerns about external influence and erosion of principled judgment. Reports suggested that the dismissal of a high-ranking official overseeing cybersecurity and intelligence may have been influenced by a social media personality. Such a revelation, if true, raises profound questions about institutional governance. The military and intelligence agencies operate under strict protocols, hierarchies, and ethical standards precisely because decisions made at the top have far-reaching consequences. Allowing non-experts or unaccountable individuals to shape critical personnel actions undermines the legitimacy of the entire system and introduces risk at the highest levels of national security. Hegseth's responses to these questions further illuminated the tension between authority and accountability. By repeatedly invoking the principle that officials serve at the pleasure of the president, he avoided addressing whether influence from external actors is appropriate or whether clear justifications exist for high-level dismissals. This approach, while technically defensible, fails to satisfy the expectations of oversight and responsible governance. Oversight is a cornerstone of democratic accountability, particularly when decisions involve national security, public trust, and ethical standards. By deflecting rather than clarifying, the nominee left a significant portion of the committee and the public with unanswered questions about the integrity and reliability of his leadership. The segment also highlighted the broader cultural consequences of leadership behavior. When senior officials avoid addressing concerns about extremism or fail to enforce ethical standards, it sets a tone that can ripple throughout the institution. Junior personnel observe not just formal policies, but also the implicit messages conveyed by leadership decisions. Tolerating or ignoring extremist rhetoric, for instance, can embolden fringe ideologies, erode trust between different units, and weaken cohesion. In a department responsible for the defense of the nation, where operational integrity and morale are critical, these consequences are not abstract. They are tangible and potentially catastrophic. Finally, this segment underscores a central theme of the confirmation hearing: the interplay between values, decisions, and institutional credibility. Senator Rosen's questioning was designed to probe whether Hegseth comprehended the full scope of his responsibilities, not just the legal or procedural, but the ethical, cultural, and operational dimensions. The nominee's hesitations, deflections, and reluctance to provide clear answers expose a gap between authority and principled leadership. In institutions where the stakes include the security of the nation and the trust of the public, this gap is not trivial. It is consequential. The hearing, in this sense, was a test not of policy knowledge or partisan alignment, but of moral clarity, judgment, and the ability to lead with accountability. As the hearing unfolded, the focus increasingly centered on the intersection between leadership, accountability, and public trust. Senator Rosen's questioning made it clear that the concern was not merely about isolated statements or personnel actions, but about the broader integrity of the Department of Defense. Leadership at this level carries symbolic as well as operational weight. Decisions made by senior officials are not only about managing immediate responsibilities. They also communicate the values and priorities of the institution to subordinates, the public, and international observers. When ethical standards are unclear or inconsistently enforced, the ripple effects are profound. Military personnel look to leadership not only for orders but for cues about what behaviors and beliefs are acceptable. If extremism, conspiracy theories, or bias are tolerated at the top, even subtly, it can erode cohesion, discipline, and trust throughout the organization. Rosen's line of questioning repeatedly returned to the issue of extremist rhetoric, particularly anti-Semitism. She asked pointed questions about whether such rhetoric should have any place in the Department of Defense, and whether officials responsible for its management should face consequences if they perpetuate or tolerate it. These were not rhetorical or politically charged questions. They were moral and institutional tests. The answers, or lack thereof, reveal how a nominee prioritizes values in the face of real ethical dilemmas. Hegseth's hesitations and evasions suggested an ambiguity that is deeply concerning in a department where clarity of principle is essential. This moment underscored the reality that leadership is judged as much by the willingness to confront ethical challenges as by administrative competence or policy knowledge. The controversy surrounding Ms. Kingsley Wilson further highlighted the stakes. As the Department of Defense press secretary, her statements had drawn widespread criticism for aligning with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Rather than addressing these concerns or taking remedial action, Hegseth defended her performance and promoted her. This decision was more than a personnel matter. It became a reflection of the department's ethical climate under his leadership. By failing to hold senior officials accountable for rhetoric that contradicts the stated values of the institution, leadership signals that extremism and prejudice may be tolerated. The consequences of such signals extend far beyond internal morale. They affect public perception, the credibility of the department, and, ultimately, the United States' ability to project moral and operational authority globally. The discussion then returned to the removal of General Hawk, which had become emblematic of broader concerns about decision-making processes. Hawk's roles as director of the NSA and commander of U.S. Cyber Command are critical to national security. Decisions about his dismissal, particularly when influenced by non-experts or external actors, raise serious questions about the stability and integrity of leadership. Rosen's insistence on a clear explanation was a probe not into partisan politics, but into the principles guiding personnel decisions in an institution tasked with protecting the nation's most sensitive information and capabilities. Leadership in this context is not just about authority. It is about exercising judgment grounded in expertise, evidence, and ethical standards. Allowing decisions to be influenced by external pressures or social media narratives undermines that foundation. Hegseth's repeated deflections in response to these questions reveal a significant tension between authority and accountability. While technically correct that officials serve at the pleasure of the president, this principle does not absolve leaders from providing rationale or justification for high-stakes actions. Oversight mechanisms, such as confirmation hearings, exist to ensure that those in positions of power exercise their authority responsibly. By framing Rosen's questions as political attacks and avoiding direct answers, Hegseth undermined the very transparency that is essential for trust and credibility. Leadership is not simply the ability to make decisions. It is the ability to explain, justify, and defend them in accordance with ethical and institutional norms. The segment also explored the implications of leadership behavior for institutional culture. When senior officials demonstrate tolerance for controversial or extremist behavior, it shapes expectations for the entire organization. Subordinates internalize these signals, and over time, they influence norms, practices, and morale. The consequences are not hypothetical. They are operational. Cohesion, discipline, and readiness depend on a shared understanding of what is acceptable and unacceptable. Leadership that evades accountability, tolerates extremist rhetoric, or allows external influence to shape personnel decisions threatens the integrity of the organization at every level. Finally, this portion of the hearing highlighted the critical role of values in guiding leadership. Senator Rosen's questions were designed to probe whether Hegseth understood that his responsibilities extended beyond procedural authority to moral and ethical stewardship. A leader who hesitates to condemn extremism, fails to enforce ethical standards, or deflects accountability cannot provide the clarity and stability necessary for effective command. In institutions where decisions carry global consequences and affect the safety and trust of millions, ambiguity is dangerous. Segment 4 demonstrates that leadership is not defined solely by rank or formal authority. It is defined by clarity of principle, commitment to ethical standards, and the courage to act decisively in alignment with those standards. As the hearing continued, the spotlight increasingly shifted to the broader implications of leadership decisions for the credibility and stability of the Department of Defense. Senator Rosen's questions were not aimed at scoring political points or creating dramatic moments. They were focused on the fundamental question of what kind of leadership is acceptable in the nation's most critical security institution. The discussion moved beyond the immediate personnel decisions of Secretary Hegseth to the long-term consequences of a leadership culture that tolerates ambiguity and fails to clearly condemn extremism. The core issue is that leadership sets the tone. Every decision, Every public statement and every personnel action communicates a message about the values of the organization. When leaders demonstrate hesitation, deflection, or acceptance of controversial behaviors, it signals to the entire department what is permissible and what is not. This has implications not just internally, but also internationally, as allies and adversaries alike observe and respond to signals from the United States military. The focus on anti-Semitism and extremist rhetoric remains central. Rosen's questioning highlighted the growing urgency of the issue in the context of rising hate crimes and anti-Semitic violence nationwide. The question was simple, yet profound. Should extremist beliefs or conspiracy theories have any place in leadership within the Department of Defense? For someone in a senior position, the answer should be instinctive. Hegseth's hesitation in providing a direct response suggested a troubling ambiguity about what is considered unacceptable. The implications of this hesitation are not theoretical. Military organizations rely on clear ethical boundaries, discipline, and shared values. When leadership hesitates to take a firm stand against hate or extremist ideologies, it weakens the institution's cohesion and compromises the trust necessary for effective operations. Leadership is not just about issuing commands. It is about modeling ethical behavior and enforcing the standards that protect the integrity of the organization. The example of Miss Kingsley Wilson was revisited, underscoring the real-world consequences of leadership decisions. Wilson, the Department of Defense press secretary, had made statements criticized for aligning with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Rather than addressing these statements or taking action to ensure accountability, Hegseth defended her and even promoted her within the department. This decision illustrates the gap between stated principles and actions. Leadership is measured not by intention, but by outcomes. By promoting an official with a documented record of controversial rhetoric, the nominee sent a signal that extremism may be tolerated at high levels, contradicting public commitments to combat hate and uphold ethical standards. The decision raises questions about judgment and moral clarity, both of which are essential in positions of national security leadership. The dismissal of General Hawk became a focal point for examining decision-making processes within the Department of Defense. Hawk's removal from the dual roles of NSA Director and U.S. Cyber Command Commander raised alarms due to reports suggesting external influence in the decision, including from a social media personality. This scenario is unprecedented in its implications. High-level military decisions should be based on formal evaluations, intelligence assessments, and expert advice, not on outside influence lacking accountability or expertise. The prospect that personnel decisions at the highest levels could be swayed by unqualified external actors undermines both institutional credibility and operational security. Rosen's insistence on clarification was not about questioning authority, but about ensuring that the mechanisms of governance and decision-making remain transparent, principled, and aligned with national security imperatives. Hegseth's repeated deflection during this exchange exposed a troubling pattern. By framing oversight questions as political attacks and emphasizing service at the pleasure of the president, he avoided addressing fundamental concerns about influence, transparency, and accountability. While technically accurate, this response fails to satisfy the expectations of ethical leadership. Oversight is essential in a functioning democracy, especially when decisions involve national security and public trust. Avoiding direct answers, particularly regarding the influence of external actors, signals either a lack of control over the department or a tolerance for inappropriate pressures, both of which have serious consequences for institutional integrity. This segment also highlights the cultural implications of leadership choices. Subordinates observe not only explicit policies, but also the implicit norms conveyed through leadership behavior. Tolerance of extremist rhetoric, hesitation in addressing ethical concerns, or reliance on external influence creates a culture where principles are fluid and accountability is optional. Over time, such cultural signals can weaken discipline, erode morale, and compromise operational effectiveness. In the Department of Defense, where the stakes include national security, public confidence, and the lives of service members, these consequences are far from abstract. They are immediate and tangible, shaping the operational readiness and integrity of the entire institution. Finally, Segment 5 underscores a connection between leadership, ethics, and public trust. Rosen's questioning was designed to probe whether Hegseth understood that leadership is more than formal authority. It is ethical stewardship. Hesitation, deflection, and a failure to clearly condemn extremism reflect gaps in judgment that could have far-reaching consequences. In institutions where decisions affect national security and international credibility, ambiguity is not merely a flaw. It is a vulnerability. The hearing, in this sense, served as a critical assessment of character, values, and the capacity to lead with accountability, demonstrating that the principles guiding leadership are just as important as the decisions themselves. Moving deeper into the hearing, the conversation expanded from individual ethical lapses and personnel decisions to the systemic implications of leadership behavior on national security and institutional stability. Senator Rosen highlighted that leadership in the Department of Defense is about far more than operational command. It is about setting the ethical tone, enforcing standards, and ensuring the trust and confidence of both the American public and the men and women serving under that leadership. Each decision made by a senior official is a signal, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt, about what behaviors are acceptable and what values the organization truly upholds. When senior leadership hesitates, equivocates, or tolerates extremist behavior, it communicates to the ranks that principles are flexible, potentially weakening the chain of command and eroding morale. This is not a theoretical concern. It is a tangible risk with operational consequences. The hearing revisited the subject of anti-Semitism and extremist rhetoric to illustrate this point. Senator Rosen's questions were direct. Should statements rooted in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories or neo-Nazi ideology have any place in positions of power within the Department of Defense? A simple no would have conveyed clarity, decisiveness, and an understanding of the moral obligations of leadership. Instead, Hegseth's responses were hesitant and deflective, framing questions as mischaracterizations or political attacks rather than acknowledging the seriousness of concerns. In an institution tasked with safeguarding national security, this hesitation is consequential. Leadership relies not only on technical competence, but also on moral clarity. Without it, subordinates lack a clear understanding of what constitutes unacceptable behavior, and the culture of accountability becomes compromised. The case of Miss Kingsley Wilson exemplified the consequences of such ambiguity. As press secretary, her statements had drawn significant criticism for promoting ideas aligned with extremist rhetoric. Despite public concern and bipartisan attention, Hegseth defended Wilson and elevated her position within the department. This decision sends a powerful message about what is tolerated at the highest levels of leadership. Leadership is defined by actions, not intentions or rhetoric. By failing to address behavior that contradicts fundamental ethical standards, Hegseth risked normalizing tolerance for extremism and undermining public confidence in the department's commitment to uphold core values. Similarly, the discussion around General Hawk's sudden removal emphasized the dangers of decision-making influenced by external, unqualified actors. Hawk held two of the most sensitive positions in national security: Director of the NSA and Commander of U.S. Cyber Command. These roles involve oversight of critical intelligence, cybersecurity operations, and the defense of America's digital infrastructure. Reports suggesting that the dismissal may have been influenced by social media personalities raise immediate concerns about the integrity and reliability of the decision-making process. Military leadership, particularly at this level, must be guided by evidence, expertise, and institutional norms, not by external pressures or personal influence. Rosen's question sought to illuminate whether these standards were being upheld. Hegseth's evasions and reliance on the principle that officials serve at the president's pleasure were insufficient to address these concerns. While technically correct, this explanation sidesteps the deeper issues of accountability, transparency, and principled decision-making. Oversight mechanisms, such as Senate confirmation hearings, exist precisely to ensure that individuals entrusted with the nation's defense exercise their authority responsibly. When leaders deflect or frame accountability as political attack, they weaken the systems designed to protect the institution's integrity and operational effectiveness. The refusal to provide clear explanations leaves critical questions unanswered and undermines confidence in the department's leadership culture. The cultural implications of leadership behavior were also a central concern in this segment. Leadership in the military is both explicit and implicit. Personnel observe not only policies but also the unwritten norms conveyed through actions and decisions. Tolerance for extremist rhetoric, promotion of controversial figures, or failure to explain critical decisions sends signals that can reshape expectations throughout the organization. Over time, this erodes discipline, undermines cohesion, and compromises operational readiness. In an institution where national security is paramount, even small lapses in moral clarity can have far-reaching consequences. Finally, Segment 6 underscores an inextricable link between leadership, ethics, and national security. Senator Rosen's questioning sought to determine whether Hegseth recognized that the responsibilities of leadership extend beyond administrative authority to include ethical stewardship, accountability, and the maintenance of public trust. Hesitation or deflection in the face of clear moral questions reveals vulnerabilities in leadership that are not abstract. They are operational and strategic. In institutions tasked with safeguarding the nation, ambiguity in ethical judgment is not just a flaw. It is a risk. The hearing, therefore, serves as a vital examination of whether a nominee possesses the moral clarity, judgment, and decisiveness necessary to lead effectively at the highest levels of national defense. As the hearing approached its later stages, the discussion shifted to the broader implications of leadership behavior on public confidence and the international credibility of the United States. Senator Rosen's questions highlighted that decisions made within the Department of Defense are not contained within the walls of the Pentagon. They are observed globally by allies, adversaries, and the American public. Leadership behavior signals priorities, values, and reliability. When senior officials fail to address extremism, allow controversial personnel to remain in key positions, or permit external influence over critical decisions, it sends a message that the department's ethical and operational foundations may be compromised. These signals have real-world consequences, affecting alliances, deterrence, and a perception of American commitment to principles of justice and integrity. The exchange also reinforced the importance of accountability as a cornerstone of effective leadership. Senator Rosen's questioning made it clear that oversight is not a political inconvenience, but a necessary mechanism to ensure that leaders exercise their authority responsibly. When Hegseth framed questions as political attacks rather than addressing the substance of concerns, it revealed a defensive posture inconsistent with the transparency expected of someone in his position. Accountability in this context is not optional. It is a safeguard for institutional credibility and operational effectiveness. Without it, decisions may appear arbitrary, morale may be undermined, and public trust in the department may erode. The segment further explored the cultural ramifications of leadership decisions. Leadership in the Department of Defense is both hierarchical and symbolic. Every promotion, every disciplinary action, and every public statement sets a precedent. The treatment of individuals such as Miss Kingsley Wilson and the circumstances surrounding General Hawk's dismissal exemplify how decisions at the top resonate throughout the organization. When leaders fail to model ethical clarity or allow external pressures to influence critical decisions, they risk embedding norms that compromise the integrity and cohesion of the institution. This is particularly consequential in a military context where unity, trust, and clarity of purpose are essential for operational effectiveness. Hegseth's reluctance to provide direct answers to questions about influence and ethical standards highlighted a tension between formal authority and principled leadership. While he correctly noted that senior officials serve at the pleasure of the president, this principle does not substitute for transparent decision-making or moral clarity. Leaders are expected to explain their reasoning, particularly when their choices affect national security and public confidence. The inability or unwillingness to do so weakens institutional integrity and raises concerns about the department's resilience in times of crisis. Leadership is not solely defined by the ability to exercise power. It is defined by the capacity to exercise it responsibly, ethically, and in a manner that maintains trust both internally and externally. The hearing also emphasized the broader ethical stakes associated with extremist rhetoric and conspiracy theories. These are not abstract political issues. They are threats to cohesion, discipline, and trust within the military. When leadership tolerates or fails to confront such behavior, it sends a signal to personnel that extremism is permissible or that ethical boundaries are negotiable. This has a cascading effect. Subordinates internalize the implicit norms set by senior leaders, which can undermine morale, erode discipline, and weaken operational readiness. in a department responsible for safeguarding national security. The failure to uphold clear ethical standards is not merely symbolic. It is a practical vulnerability. Segment 7 further examined the consequences for public perception and international credibility. Allies rely on the United States to demonstrate consistency, moral clarity, and principled leadership in its defense institutions. When decisions appear opaque, influenced by non-experts, or tolerant of extremist behavior, the signal sent to international partners is one of unpredictability and weakened reliability. Adversaries, conversely, may perceive these gaps as opportunities to exploit. Thus, the stakes of leadership behavior extend far beyond the immediate institutional context. They have strategic, diplomatic, and operational ramifications that touch every aspect of national security policy. Finally, this segment reinforced the central theme of the hearing. Leadership is defined as much by ethical clarity, judgment, and accountability as by operational competence or policy knowledge. Senator Rosen's questioning revealed that Hegseth's responses frequently relied on deflection, framing oversight as political attacks, and avoiding direct acknowledgement of ethical concerns. This pattern exposes vulnerabilities in leadership that affect both institutional culture and the perception of credibility domestically and internationally. Segment 7 illustrates that the effectiveness of the Department of Defense is inseparable from the moral and ethical standards upheld by those at its helm, and that hesitation or ambiguity at the top can have consequences that extend far beyond individual personnel decisions.